Hi, and welcome to session 15 of Activate.
Session 15. Can't believe we've gone that far already, Jen.
We have, and this week we are going to be learning how to tell our story. We're going to be using a tool to help us do that, a way of telling our story so that it rolls off the tongue, so it's easy for you to use in different situations, and so that you can really shape it to the context and to the people that you are talking to.
Brilliant. So, what is this tool? We call it the 6-word story. And there are 2 examples of this, Jen, in the handouts. So I've written mine down. Jenny, you've written yours down.
Yeah.
So you'll have a chance to look at them in writing. Although we're actually going to hear one of our stories at the end of this session.
Yeah.
Yes, keep you on sitting on the edge of your seat to find out whose story you are going to hear. So what do we do? The 6-word story is basically, it's very practical, and it's simply about structuring, telling your story, your faith story, your faith journey around 6 words. And Jenny's going to dig more into that in a moment. But the power of story is great. So Leonard Ravenhill, the author and writer on revival, said this: a man or a woman with an experience of God is never at the mercy of a man with an argument. So people may come to you with all sorts of theories, latest ideas, things they've been reading on the internet about Jesus or about the Bible or about the church. They may have all sorts of arguments, but when you tell your story, nobody can argue with that. It is powerful. In fact, in Revelation, book of Revelation, chapter 12, verse 11, it says this, that the saints overcame Satan by the blood of the Lamb, victory on the cross, by the word of their testimony, and loving not their lives unto death. Finished work of Christ, that's sort of settled. Our testimony is something we can use, and then loving not our lives to death, that's the Jesus is Lord piece that we've talked about before. So what is this story and why does it work? Well, if you remember from the disciple maker's journey, we talked about the four parts to this, which don't always come in a neat order, but they more or less make up the stages that most people will go through, from connecting to chatting to inviting to multiplying. We've talked about the connecting stage, where we think about going from few to many, having not just a few friends, but many, many friends, many, many connections. When we get to chatting, the sub-journey here, Jen, that we need to go on is from natural conversations to spiritual conversations. And actually telling our story is one of the best ways that we can engage someone with a spiritual conversation, which will help us to figure out, are they people of peace? So Jen, how do we get started?
Well, yeah, the first thing you're going to do is to figure out what your 6 words are. The basis of the 6-word story is that you need something to kind of hang your story on, like helping it to run through like the arc of a story so that you don't lose your way. Now, they may be like a set of 3 pairs of words. They could be 6 individual words. That bit doesn't matter, but you need to figure out what they are. So you need to take some time to sort of sit down and go, what does my story look like? I guess if you were writing them out, you might use your 6 words as the headings maybe for the paragraphs to help you figure out what comes next.
Yeah.
And once you've got those 6 words, you then need to make some notes to fill out those spaces. And I think it's important to say you don't necessarily have to start at the beginning of your story. It doesn't have to be like, for me, I was born in Staffordshire. No, okay. The story still wants to be interesting. And sometimes starting in the middle or at a pivotal point in your life can be a really great way of starting a story, because it'll help it to be engaging, won't it? And interesting.
A lot of films seem to do that, don't they, Jen?
Yeah, films and books as well. Lots of different stories start like that because it's helpful to draw people in. We want them to be engaged and listening to what we've got to say.
Yeah. So as we're telling those, fleshing out those 6 words, and they can be like 6 individual words. They could be, 3 pairs of words. They could be 2 sets of 3 words. They could be one statement.
Yes.
I think one of the best 6-word stories in total is the blind man who was healed in the Bible.
Absolutely.
And his 6-word story, I was blind, now I see. That was his whole story in 6 words.
Yeah.
So use the 6 words however you want. Flesh them out as Jen has described. And you're gonna get some chance to practice this, writing these down as well as telling them. And what we also want to try and achieve is to include something about how we met Christ in our story. So often it's 3 parts. It's like before I became a Christian, how I became a Christian, how my life's changed since I became a Christian. That can be a bit monotonous or a bit boring, so we want to mix it up a bit sometimes, but often starting there is a good place to start. And we want to particularly be able to talk about the difference that Christ has made in our lives. I think that's what has impact on people. When we talk about the fact that we were, riddled with anxiety for years and we suddenly found we had real peace, or we carried shame or guilt in our lives and suddenly discovered through God's forgiveness that we could live at peace with him. Or we might find that, we were struggling to find a job and, God helped us get a job. Whatever it might be, what's the difference that Christ has made in your life? How has he answered your prayers? One of the other things that we often do while we're telling our story is to try and, if it's possible and if it's relevant, to include something about Jesus, what we discovered about Jesus along the way.
Yeah.
So for people who've been brought up in a Christian home, that's not always quite so easy. But for me, as a 12-year-old boy, I'd never really heard the gospel before. And when I heard it, it made sense. If you read my 6-word story, you'll find out how that worked. But in my story, I will describe, and I heard this about Jesus and I discovered he'd done this for me. So I'm actually weaving elements of the gospel into my story as I tell it, which then makes it much easier to pick up on later on in the conversation. So if you can do that, that's always a bonus, but you don't have to. So what are the useful tips have you got, Jen?
Well, I think one of them is to practice telling your story and maybe try and condense it. See if you can get down to sort of 2 or 3 minutes, because sometimes you'll be in conversation with people and you'll have loads of time to tell your story. And other times you'll be in a queue and you'll need to be able to say it a bit faster. So being able to condense it down so that it's shorter, but you can still share it with people is really helpful. And there's a big no as well in this.
What's that, Jen?
It's don't use religious words or jargon. Okay, the word sanctification should not turn up in your story. Don't use words that people won't understand.
What about eschatological?
Yeah,
Can you put that one in?
no.
Okay.
No religious words and no jargon. You want your story to be accessible to people so that they understand you when you've finished. Because what you're looking to do next is to actually draw them into conversation. When you finish your story, you want to be asking questions like, well, have you ever had an experience of God? Or perhaps, well, have you ever prayed? What happened when you prayed? Asking those questions that draw them into further conversation with you and open that door for you to figure out, are they leaning in?
Yeah.
Or are they maybe leaning back, turning away, fiddling with their watch because they'd like to go?
Absolutely. And this whole thing of practice, Jen, is so important. I mean, I've probably told my story, 50, 100, I don't know how many times I've told my story, but I'm so used to telling my story, I can almost do it in my sleep. And because I'm really familiar with it, I can be flexible with it. I can adapt it to the particular context, the person I'm speaking to, as you say, how long the conversation has got to run. And I can put in perhaps particularly relevant examples of the way God's done things in my life. So if I meet someone who's, struggling with debt, I can talk about how God answered our prayers and helped me and my wife get out of really serious debt at one point in our lives. So, but I can only do that if I'm confident with it. I remember once having a conversation with someone, Jen, and it was a person serving at the kiosk in a petrol station, and I started talking to him and discovered actually that after a certain point I couldn't think of another word to say, and I just had to walk out of the garage with an unfinished conversation. I felt so stupid. But when we have our story at our fingertips, it makes it so easy to tell it. So obviously, it does depend on us having a real relationship with God. If we haven't got that kind of real relationship with God to talk out of, then we're going to be a bit stuck for things to describe and stories to tell. But practice does make perfect. Remember those 3 B's of finding the people of peace? Be friendly, be curious, be ready. And what we want to be ready with is our story. That's why this session is so important and will help you practically to be ready. So Jen, have you got a story to tell us?
So yeah, Nick, I do. So my 6 words are abandoned, alone, powerful prayer, belonging, family. So I don't have like sets of words. I just have a random collection of those things. So I'm going to tell you my 6-word story. So when I was really, really young, about 4, my parents split up. And after they split up, I didn't see my dad for about probably nearly sort of 15 years. And in that time, I really developed this sense of rejection, of loss, of feeling abandoned by my father. And for me, that worked itself out as, to be honest, of me just finding ways to try and fill the hole that was really obvious. You know, I was upset most of the time. I was really angry. I was just devastated by the loss. And so as I got to my teenage years, I did things that most teenagers do, but I'll be honest, I went all out, okay? So loads of drinking, loads of parties, just, you know, using sex, using drugs, all these things trying to fill this hole because I was aware that I was unsatisfied and I didn't really know how to fill it. And that's despite growing up in a Christian home where, in fact, people have been talking about Jesus all the time. But although I'd accepted Jesus as a child, I'd never really developed a relationship with him. That didn't happen. I went to church on Sundays, I turned up at youth groups, but I didn't really know him. And then skip forward to sort of the end of my teens, I was really, really unwell, okay? Like horribly, horribly sick. And I was in bed for about 2 weeks. And whilst I was in bed with lots and lots of time on my hands, God really spoke to me and was calling me back. And I was utterly terrified. I didn't want to go back to God because I didn't really know him. And I was afraid that actually all the things that I'd done were way too big for God to forgive. And actually what I didn't know was that throughout this whole time, one of my aunts had been praying for me. She still does. She still prays for me every single week. And after I'd been unwell and God had been talking to me, we went to a party, family party, and my aunt was there. And she just came up to me and she just said, Jenny, it doesn't matter what you've done and it doesn't matter what you think. Nothing is too big for God to forgive. He loves you. That was all she said. And I was just like, oh my gosh, she must know. How does she know?
She's been reading my mail.
Yeah, I was like, she must be reading her mail. How does she know what's happening? But actually, that started a process of me really getting to know God for myself. And the thing that I found that I completely wasn't expecting was that God was a loving father and that he utterly adores me. I am the absolute apple of his eye. And when I decided to follow Jesus, the difference that really made in my life was that not only did I have a father that loved me, but I found a family. I found a sense of belonging. I found a community of people who I would class as my ride or die, okay? These people who absolutely have my back. They're the family that I didn't have. And that hole of feeling rejected, abandoned, and alone got filled with Jesus. And in its place has been this sense of belonging, this sense of family, peace, joy. It's been amazing. And it's probably the best decision that I ever made in my life. Yeah, that's my 6-word story.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jen, for telling us your story tonight.